I host a show for PBS Digital Studios called Game Show, which is through Killscreen, but I spend part of my time doing that. And it's really interesting, people's expectations about what they want. This idea that being a journalist or a critic is certainly a very amorphous one. But I did some meetups on the West Coast. It's the first time I've ever done that, to meet my fans, and it was really fun. First of all, I'm not used to being the center of attention. But the other thing was when I asked them, well, what do you think I should do an episode about? No one had any replies. So in some ways, I'm not always convinced that people know exactly what it is that they want. And I think one of the challenges now is that I think that drives, particularly on YouTube, a lot of that ecosystem, is that if you do know what you want, it's never been easier than ever to find someone who will sort of scratch that particular itch for you. So I think having a really defined editorial sensibility so that people know what it is that you're getting. I think everything on the internet needs to justify its own self-existence. So people should be able to sort of understand what your guiding ethos is. Because if you can't define it, then you're leaving it up to other people, and if they can't figure it out, then they're just going to go somewhere else.
Right. And we've also seen sort of the line between what makes a game, targeted at hardcore gamers versus casual gamers really blur over the years. As you all are considering what to cover, how do you best choose, what to cover based on sort of such a large and varied audience? It could be anyone from, the soccer mom on the subway playing Candy Crush Saga versus the, whoever playing, round 15 of Call of Duty, or even Gone Home.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that I don't know, I feel like even though you have some games on the social side that are huge, I don't know necessarily that the audience is interested in news about that game. Aside from updates or releases, they're much more likely to look up FAQs, or they want information about how better to play the game, but I'm not necessarily convinced. It's a strange thing, and that we now have in this ecosystem these giant franchises that people have no desire to have any kind of editorial insight into how those things are necessarily made. Maybe that's just maybe that's just a new thing, and eventually, everyone who's playing, Candy Crush Saga or Kim Kardashian Hollywood or whatever it might be, will become interested in those types of things. But yeah, it is a little strange in that sense.
Yeah, I think part of that though might be due to the audiences built up by sites like Polygon and Kotaku. Inherently they're sites that attract hardcore readers, which is great when you start a site, because those are the readers who will come and read 200 stories a day and comment on everything and help build your site up. And then as you sort of blossom into a bigger site, you start trying to attract a bigger audience, a wider audience, which sometimes includes casual gamers, and they don't get along. They don't in any way want to get, it's really interesting trying to deal with that, because it is a very strange thing. This is one of the few hobbies or art forms, or whatever you want to refer to gaming as, that to me feels so welcoming and so distant at the same time. And I think it is because, a lot of people, I certainly did, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I grew up playing games from when they started, sort of, and was definitely a nerd and got picked on all the time. So I definitely feel hey, I got my lumps. I'm a gamer, goddammit. You're not allowed to be a gamer because you just started playing. A part of me feels that way. But I could see why people would feel that way, and trying to write for those two audiences is very, very hard. I think it makes it a challenge.
I think that, because writing for Mashable, which, we originally built our audience in the social media sphere and the tech sphere, so we have kind of this precedent to have a more casual, friendly audience and have a lot of social games and have a lot of iPhone and Facebook games on our website. And as a person with a similar background to Brian's, it's hard for me to open my heart to those games, but at the same time, you have to kind of respect the editorial value of writing about this thing. And I certainly spent time writing a Kim Kardashian Hollywood guide this summer. And
What did you learn?
Oh man, I got all the way up to A-list.
A-list. What do you find at the top?
Nothing. Spoilers. So empty. But that
That's
was
a deep
guy.
message, doesn't it?
Like, and that's the thing. I know at Kotaku, one of the biggest stories we had for years was a guide to Farmville. It was a guide. It wasn't. I mean, I guess it is journalism, but it was not the form of
service.
Yes,
right?
it's very servicey. But like that's what seems to click with coverage, ongoing coverage of social, covering Zynga as a company. The people who play Farmville seemingly have zero interest in Zynga. The people who play Call of Duty want to know everything about Bobby Kotick and Activision, and know who Bobby Kotick is.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, part of it is like having a really close read on your readership, right? But then you have to figure out the spots where you can be counterintuitive about what they're telling you, right? We had a big story this past summer about The Sims 4, and they took out the swimming pools. And I think I was the first person to run that. Other people followed up on
Pulitzer bait, clearly Pulitzer bait.
But you know, it was interesting because, again, outside of the kind of main AAA publicity feedback loop that you get all the time that you don't have to think about when you're in the middle of it, like there was this huge Sims audience that was, you know, existing on its own in this little pocket universe, waiting for news about the game, and because you know we were kind of on top of that story early on, they came to Kotaku, and those were new readers for us, and you know our user metrics bore that out. These were people who had been to Kotaku in the last month. Well, that's the way we track uniques. So it was really interesting to think about. Oh yeah, The Sims. You know, the kind of game that was the bastion of teen girls in the '90s, right? Like and look, I was raising a kid. Yeah, no, but I was raising a kid like who was crazy about The Sims in the '90s, in the early aughts. So you think about that game in that way, but they grow up and they become readers. They become people you can touch and see it, and they'll come to your site. So it's the idea of getting a read on your readership and knowing where you can push them, knowing where you have to follow them. And I think it's a tricky kind of thing nowadays because there's a little bit of balkanization in terms of like how the communities of people who play games like identify and what they're interested in. It's super challenging, but it's also really fun when you feel like, all right, I've got a line into the insight of the Sims players now, or like the Mario Kart people. I think I know what they want to read, so let's go there.
Now, I do think, though, it's interesting, there's a difference between covering, ongoing coverage of a social game or a casual game versus originating coverage. So you look at, you know, the next Farmville, not Farmville 2, that's a terrible example, but the next big social game that comes out or casual game that comes out, there is, interestingly enough, it seems like a lot of interest in that. So there are ways to cover those sort of games, and it's, you know, it's changed drastically. It used to be that, you know, even 3 or 4 years ago, you wrote about those games, and in the comments, I don't know if you still get it, but I remember on Kotaku in the comments it would be, "Why are you covering this? It's not a game." And it's like, really? Farmville's not a game.
That's diminished to a little bit, you know.
And also one counterpoint to people wanting to know news about a game, let's look back at February and Flappy Bird.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Flappy Bird.
Yeah, that was something that people wanted to know every incremental
Right.
update because it had a dramatic story.
Right, and that is the point. That's the thing. It's not the game. The game's important, but what's really important, what people really want to hear about are the people, the things, the people who make the games, the human stories behind the games. And Flappy Bird had an amazing story.
It's funny because Killscreen is much newer than any of our sites. Is much smaller as well. So we've often, for me, the mandate for our editorial director is just make sure that our homepage and everything we do is going to be different. That it shouldn't be anywhere else. And if I want to make sure that when I'm looking at the homepage of a variety of different gaming sites, to make sure that Killscreen always looks different. And so I think what's interesting is I think this idea that like a game site can be all things to all people is I think unfortunately there was a time and place, but given the size of the industry, and also, one of the other mandates that we have is that we don't cover like the business of games. Like we don't cover publishers, we don't talk about publishers. We're very interested just in creatives. Because, if you look at other industries, like there's Pitchfork, and then there's Billboard, and then you have Variety, and then you also have Entertainment Weekly. And generally speaking, I'm more interested in kind of like cultivate. I would much rather Killstream be the gaming outlet in the culture category than the culture outlet in the gaming category. And some of that is because, in the war for like winning a particular search term, or, no matter what we put up about, Call of Duty is probably not gonna outrank any of your particular sites. And, I think we're pretty happy to have it that way. But hey, you want to do some like small game by an Indian developer on the Chala on the western coast of India, then we'll be number one Google for that.
Yeah, and not only have we seen like the definition of a gamer change, but we've also seen the definition and purpose of games really evolve over the years. I mentioned Games for Change before. They're really leading the cause for games for a social good. How do you see games with a purpose perhaps other than just entertainment really sticking out from the crowd?
I mean, there's going to have to be some cribbing from the entertainment-centric games production, right? There's going to have to be a certain amount of hype building, with Games for Change and games with a social focus. I think the problem has been that they lead with the earnestness, right? They lead with the idea that this is something that can have a social impact versus the fact that, hey, there's a story here, here's how we created it. Like the more typical narratives of like cultural production, like are on the back burner versus the idea that it's a game that will help you learn about the transatlantic slave trade. It's like, that's great, but if I'm reading a textbook in game form, then I'm going to be as interested in that as I am in reading a textbook, which is not fair. So I think that's one thing that Games for Change, if we're using that as a blanket term, can do to kind of aid the hook of more entertainment-focused games.
It's interesting because I realized 12, because how old is Games for Change? Like 10, 12 years old?
Tell us, Ozzy.
11 years old. I think that was like more of an anomaly. I think one of the things, we're seeing a lot of games, particularly on the smaller side. So Mountain, for example, is a good example, where, does that qualify as a Games for Change? Never Alone is like a good kind of middle example where they're much more explicit. But then, does Gone Home count as a Games for Change? I mean, at this point, this is, great for Aussie and for Games for Change. There's so much more that you can pull from that doesn't have to like explicitly be, do you learn about this? I mean, so Frank Bruni, I guess, in the Times had an essay this week. I guess he's putting together a collection about whether or not sort of contemporary art, pop culture, et cetera, is up for the social tumult of the day. So things like Ferguson and all these things that are happening in this world, elsewhere, Syria, Israel, Palestine, all of these different things, and he's kind of asking this big question about whether or not art is reflecting those types of shifts, because that's sort of what art ostensibly should do. And I think what's been great is that as games sort of mature, is that they're sort of pulling from a different DNA. If you just make things that respond to the world around you, then you have a much greater chance to sort of quote unquote be a Games for Change. But nobody talks about 12 Years a Slave as being like a movie for change, right? That's just, that's a picture, right? That's the name for that. So I'm hoping that's what happens. Although for this year's Game Awards, I did vote for Advanced Warfare as a Games for Change nominee. No one else bid.
You like those music?
I do. Press X for, was it Press X? Pay respects?
I think it's already happening though. Like Gone Home is a prime example of that. It was interesting. I judge on a bunch of different awards and like the discussions, including Games for Change. How often is that going to happen where you have Gone Home essentially in every award that year was either winning or up to win, including Games for Change. And it's like, that was one of the discussions, I think, like, is this a game for change? And it's like, why not? Sure. But I think when it comes to trying to get promotion or trying to get coverage of games for change, I think what developers and publishers their publishers, need to do is the same thing that journalists need to do, and that is find their audience. But the difference is they're finding their audience among the journalists. There are people who would probably never cover Games for Change, and frankly, I don't think, it makes